Welcome to Inside Exchange, Topics for Manufacturers, a series bringing you expert-led presentations on the issues that matter most to members. The curated topics in this series feature presentations from associate members and subject matter experts through on-demand and live webinars to help Hudson Valley manufacturers. If you have topics you'd like us to explore in future episodes, contact us at info@councilofindustry.org. Let's begin.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Insight Exchange Topics for Manufacturers. In this series, we hope to bring expert-led conversations straight to you. Today, I am joined by David Garner, EHS Director at Walden Environmental Engineering. Walden has been serving clients for over 30 years, offering environmental consulting, health and safety services, and engineering solutions tailored to support businesses like yours. In this episode, David will discuss the top 10 OSHA violations and updates, including rule changes, reporting requirements, and how to prepare for potential inspections. We know the safety of your workforce is always a priority, and whether you're staying on top of the latest updates or just brushing up on the basics, this conversation will help you stay informed and prepared. David, thank you again for agreeing to talk with us today about the top 10 OSHA violations and updates. We appreciate your time. Why don't you get started by telling us a little about yourself and Walden?
Thank you. I'm David Garner. I'm the EHS Director for Walden Environmental Engineering. We're going to talk about the top 10 OSHA violations for manufacturing in the last year. At Walden, we've been in business for over 30 years, and we help companies by consulting. We provide environmental health and safety services, as well as civil and environmental engineering. We can come in and help you through a variety of ways, whether that be auditing, training, building programs, or reporting for the EPA. Here you can see a pretty extensive list of some of the services that we offer. And if you have specific needs, you can give us a call and we can help you figure out how to solve it. So our top 10 citations in reverse order. Number 10 is fall protection. This one is typically the number one most cited standard for construction, but it still makes the top 10 in general industry. So some of the most common things that are cited are lack of guardrails, safety nets, and personal fall arrest systems. Next is failure to assess fall hazards. Then inadequate training on fall protection systems, and then not providing or not wearing the fall protection systems. These are part of a area where anytime that you're working over 4 feet in elevation, you need to have some kind of a protection for your team. They need to either have a guardrail that prevents their ability to fall, or they need to have a type of personal fall arrest. With that, there's a program that is required, there's training that's required, there's annual inspections that are required. And so if you have people who are subject to fall hazards, you need to make sure that you build out the entire system that supports this topic. Portable fire extinguishers. They seem very basic and they're everywhere that you look, but they're also really easy to overlook. So if they're not readily accessible or properly mounted, that means that you need to have them at least every 75 feet, and you need to have them mounted at least 4 inches off the floor, but not above 5 feet off the floor to the top handle. Employees who are using fire extinguishers need to be trained on how to use those. You can do a classroom only training, but it's best to do a hands-on training where employees get a chance to actually use a fire extinguisher and experience what it feels like to operate a fire extinguisher. And then last, the fire extinguisher is expired or is improperly maintained. You wouldn't be able to count on it in case of emergency that it would actually operate as it's intended. Electrical always seems to be a big one with these. First is overloaded circuits. So if you've got a plug that looks like it's got a hedgehog just plugs coming out everywhere. It's absolutely overloaded. Another one that goes along with that is having daisy chains. So you've got a extension cord plugged into a power strip or a power strip plugged into a power strip. That's not allowed. It draws too much energy. Lack of proper circuit protection devices. So if you're operating near water, whether that's in a production environment where there could be potential exposure to water, or if it's in a kitchen or restroom, they need to have GFCI protection. That can be on the outlet itself or through the breaker, but they need to have some kind of protection so that if there is a fault, it will protect people. Exposed electrical components, anytime that you see wiring out exposed, that's a problem. Whether it be there's a junction box that is missing its cover, or the wiring has been pulled into place and is just left exposed. They should always be properly covered and protected so that no one is exposed to an electrical hazard. And then inadequate or missing grounding for electrical systems. So when you're inspecting your extension cords, be sure to inspect to make sure that the grounding prong is there. A tool should either be double insulated, which will be marked on the case, or it should have a grounding prong. And if there's a spot for that grounding prong, it needs to be there. More on electrical wiring. Use unapproved wiring material. Very obvious, but people still will use components that are not rated for what they're being used for. If something has a UL rating, then you need to follow what it was designed to be used for. You can't take something that's for home use and then use it in an industrial environment, or you can't take a wall box outlet and turn it into a extension cord. Exposed or frayed wiring. Again, this goes back to inspecting tools. If you have frayed wiring on your tools, or you've cut the insulation and it's wrapped up in electrical tape, those are the kinds of things that jump out to a OSHA auditor, and they will be pulling that back and seeing if it has any exposed or frayed wiring, and can absolutely cite you for it. And then again, inadequate grounding of electrical systems. Eye and face protection. So all PPE requires a hazard assessment, and that hazard assessment needs to be completed and certified by you, saying that you've done it and that it is accurate and correct. You only have to do that once for each job, but you do need to have it, and you do need to maintain written records of that. That's a common gap when we're doing audits, that we see facilities do not have that hazard assessment in place. Providing inadequate or no personal protective equipment. As an employer, it's your job to provide a safe work environment for your employees. And part of that is providing them the PPE that they need. And then last is lack of training on proper use and maintenance of PPE. So you need to provide the PPE, but you also need to tell your employees how to properly wear it, how to maintain it, and when should they replace it. So if someone is wearing a respirator, they need to know how frequently do they need to change the filters on the respirator. If it's a pair of safety glasses, you need to know if it gets scratched up, that's the time that it obstructs your vision, it weakens the plastics, and you need to replace it. Machine guarding. So inadequate or missing machine guards. Anytime that you can reach to the point of operation of a piece of equipment without using a tool to remove the guard, or having to power it down or break a interlock system, then it's not adequately guarded. Failure to address and identify machine hazards. This is, again, you have to prevent someone from being able to reach the point of operation. And then last is lack of training on machine safety. Forklifts and powered industrial trucks, operation without proper training. The standard requires you to provide training to operators at least once every 3 years. And then anytime that there's been a incident, change of equipment, or other event that makes you think the training isn't adequate, you need to retrain. Lack of regular equipment inspections. Equipment should be inspected at least daily, but it's best practice if you have multiple shifts to have a inspection at the beginning of every shift. And then failure to adhere to safe operating procedures. Part of that training is how to safely operate the forklift, and you shouldn't be overloading it. You shouldn't be driving it in donuts and doing other things that are not safe with your forklifts. Number 3, lockout tagout. This is one of those that if you have a incident with lockout tagout, there's a high likelihood of a serious injury or even a fatality for lockout related events. So absence of energy control procedures. You're required to have a procedure that's written for every piece of equipment that you operate, and that procedure needs to be reviewed on an annual basis. So you need to go through and ensure that everything is still correct. You didn't make modifications to the machine or where it's powered from, and your written procedure doesn't match with that. Lack of employee training. You need to have annual training for your lockout procedures, and it's best if you do that with a hands-on component so that you can visually observe someone performing that lockout procedure and ensuring that they know how to safely implement lockout tagout. And then last is failure to use the proper lockout tagout procedures. Respiratory protection is number 2, and the absence of a written respiratory protection program. If your people are wearing any kind of a respirator, including an N95 mask, you need to have a written respiratory protection program. If they are voluntarily wearing a N95 mask, you don't have to have a written program, but you do need to have the Appendix D for that program so that it shows that they have understood that there are hazards with wearing a respirator and they are willing to accept those risks on a voluntary basis. That's great, but if there's at any point it goes from being voluntary to being required, then you need to have that respiratory protection program. Fit testing for respirators is also required for any tight-fitting respirators. So if you're requiring a N95 mask, that requires a fit test. If you have half mask or full face respirators, that requires a fit test as well, if it have a full beard. And then lack of proper maintenance and storage of respirators. Anytime that a respirator isn't being worn, it needs to be in a sealed bag or box so that it can't get contaminated from the environment. That could be as simple as taking it off to go to the bathroom or when you're finished at the end of the day. If you just leave it laying out in the open and dust and other contaminants can settle onto the respirator, then when you put it on, the contaminants are already inside the mask and it's not doing you any good. You also have to clean respirators on a regular basis, replace the filters as needed. Sometimes you have to replace the face shield so that it doesn't become scratched or damaged, and all of those things could lead to a violation if you fail to do it. And then the number 1 most common violation is hazard communication. This covers a lot of territory, but hazard communication is consistently among the top violations both in construction industry and in general industry. Having a written program. Everybody who has hazardous chemicals, and that's anything that has a SDS where it says that there is a hazard associated with it or is listed on the OSHA Z tables, is required to have a written hazard communication program. That could be as simple as having WD-40 or bleach. Training and information. So you have to provide training to everyone who is exposed to any chemical hazards, and you have to provide them information that falls under the right to know. So you need to be able to show that your employees can identify what those hazards are, and they can identify where to find the SDS for a given chemical. So that leads into the next one. You need to have the SDSs readily available. Those SDSs can be digital, they can be a hard copy, they can be both, but you need to have those readily available, and all of your team needs to know where to find them if there's an emergency. And then inadequate labeling of chemical containers. So anytime that a chemical is not in its original container, you have to apply a label, and there are specific items on the GHS standard that are required to be on that label. And if you have unlabeled containers, or if you take a orange juice bottle and put window cleaner in it, that's a violation. And they absolutely will look for it, and they will cite you if they find it. I've also got a few updates on OSHA and some rule changes that have happened recently. So one that I get asked questions about on a frequent basis is OSHA's amended walk-around rule. OSHA changed the walk-around rule to allow a third party to participate in a OSHA audit. And the biggest concern here is that it allows union representatives from non-union sites to be a part of a audit at a facility. There are some limitations on when they can be there or what they can do, but because of the concerns around it, there have been multiple lawsuits filed. And even though this is currently in effect, I expect that the current administration will eventually drop support for their side of the lawsuit, and this rule will either be rescinded or will go away due to losing a legal argument. OSHA. Next is OSHA's heat protection rule. In 2024, they proposed a heat protection rule, and it was open for comment through the end of December. The current administration has paused all new rulemaking, and this was not published before the end of the last administration, so it's unlikely that it's going to come out anytime soon. That said, you're still required to protect your team from any hazardous heat, and you can be cited under the general duty clause by OSHA for that. The New York Department of Labor is also focused on heat stress and will continue to do so. And the state assembly is also working on passing a heat-specific act for making sure that workers are protected in high heat environments. The OSHA proposed rule required you to have a written program. Without that rule, it is not required to have a written program, but you should have a program, written or otherwise, that does protect your team. They required that you identified periods of excessive heat, and they began the recording requirement at 80 degrees. You had to train workers on heat stress prevention and how to recognize the signs and symptoms of heat illness. You had to provide cool water with additional paid breaks every 2 hours. Allow new or returning workers to gradually increase and basically work hardened to get used to working in high heat environments. This one was important because most heat-related fatalities happen within the first 3 days of someone being in a high heat environment. It doesn't take more than a couple weeks for someone to get fully acclimatized to be working in a high heat environment, but that first few days, it's really easy for them to overdo it and be hit by heat stress and get hospitalized or worse. And then have a buddy system to check on one another in high heat environments to make sure that no one was left working alone, or if they were working alone, there was regular checkups from other people to make sure that they were still okay. There's a lot of things that you can do with heat stress, including providing cooling towels, water breaks, water stations, having fresh fruit available, whatever you can do to show that you're being proactive and addressing the heat. Without a standard in place, it'll be on you to prove that you're doing what is needed to protect your team. And so having those things in place will go a long ways with OSHA towards showing that you're trying your best to stay compliant. Next, I want to talk about the OSHA Whistleblower Protection Program. Anytime that someone makes a complaint or is otherwise involved with a OSHA inspection or citation, it's possible that a workplace might want to punish them as a result. That could be they got injured and they had to call it into OSHA, and the company wants to try to do something retaliatory, but you cannot do that. They will absolutely cite you for trying to punish someone who participated in a OSHA event or for having an injury that caused you to have to call OSHA and got a citation. Anything that is an adverse action is not allowed. So that could be something as serious as firing them or laying them off, but it could also be changing their job shift or changing their job title to something that's not equal, but it's a less status. If you deny any benefits, fail to rehire, reduce their hours, their pay, their bonuses, any of that can be seen as a retaliation against those people. For each of those conditions, there's a criminal and civil penalty that could be enforced. On the civil side, it could be up to $16,550 per violation. And if they consider it to be a willful or repeat violation, it would be $165,000. On the criminal enforcement, you could face up to 6 months in jail or up to $250,000 in fines. It's just not worth it. Make sure that if you already had any issues with an employee, to document. And if you're going to proceed with firing someone, that you had a pre-existing reason and that it has nothing to do with it. And I would absolutely advise you to, before you take any adverse action, contact a labor attorney and discuss with them what your documentation is, what you're preparing to do, and make sure that you can convince them that it is a reasonable action. On that line, OSHA has updated their fines. First, we'll talk about the types of fines that are types of violations that you're likely to see. First is other than serious. This is the lowest level of violation. A other than serious violation is typically a paperwork violation. You will never get an other than serious violation if someone has been injured. But if someone is not exposed to the hazard or it's a paperwork violation, then that's the level that you're likely to get. A serious violation would be if there was an injury, a employee was exposed to a hazard, and they felt like it could have done serious bodily harm, then you'll get a serious. Willful means you knew what to do and you didn't do it anyways. And it's a high bar to reach a willful, but especially if it's common knowledge or you didn't follow basic safety procedures or you were doing the right thing on one part of your job site, but you weren't on another, then you increase the risk of getting a willful. And a repeat violation is just that. They've come out, they've cited you for something before, and then you had the same kind of violation within 5 years of that first citation. So the minimum and maximum penalties for a other than serious, 0 is the lowest, and 16,500 is the highest penalty for a citation of that kind. Serious is $1,200 on the low end, and again, 16,500 on the high end. Willful or repeat violations both have a minimum of 11,823 and a maximum of 165,514. Posting requirements. So if you get a citation, you're required to post the citation and any response or corrective actions that you take on it. If you don't do that, you could be cited anywhere from $0 up to the 16,550 maximum. And then failure to abate is 16,550 per day for up to 30 days. So if you get a citation, you'll have a window that you're set in the citation, usually 15 days, that you have to correct whatever was found in the citation. If you can't do it, so you need to purchase a piece of equipment and there's a long lead time on, and there's just no way to get what you need in the time window available, reach out to OSHA, explain the situation, and they're very lenient and allow you to extend that window. But not doing it and not communicating why you can't do it in that window is not acceptable and will lead to citations. If you need to do that, be sure to have your documentation in place and let them know. We had a client that had to provide a ventilation system. It was a 6-month time from when you ordered till that ventilation system could be installed. And they let OSHA know that, and they extended the time window. Because of manufacturing delays, that window had to get pushed out again. They provided that communication from the ventilation manufacturer, and OSHA allowed them to extend it again. That said, once you close out a citation, expect OSHA to show up within the next year. Sometimes it'll be within a matter of weeks, sometimes it'll be later, but they're going to come back and check and make sure that the things that you said you corrected are actually corrected and close out that audit. There's a few upcoming deadlines. 2 that have recently passed are the annual Tier 2 reporting, also known as the community right to know filing, and the annual hazardous waste reporting. If you haven't done these, it's best to go ahead and get those submitted as soon as you can, but hopefully you were able to get these submitted in a timely basis. The hazardous waste monthly report. So if you're a large quantity generator, you need to submit your monthly report. The toxic release inventory is the next big deadline. That's July 1st, but it is open, so you can submit that right now if you have to report your TRI. Also, Title V reporting, if you're subject to Title V, the next deadline is April 30th. And of course, all of these are subject to site-specific requirements. So if your site has permits or requirements that go above and beyond these, you may have additional reporting requirements that happen sooner. Does anyone have any questions on these?
Thanks, David. This is great. So it seems like a lot. I think in terms of the top 10 violations, it didn't seem like there was anything completely surprising. I think feels like the same things we're hearing pretty regularly. Was there anything that you thought caught you off guard? Or, I mean, I'm imagining it's probably hard to catch you off guard.
The subjects there were pretty much in line with what I expect and what I've seen in the past. I have seen there be more electrical violations and have fall protection fall off for general industry, but that's the only one that could be unexpected.
Do you think there's anything that maybe isn't on this list yet, but is stewing around in another open tab in the back of your head that our members should be thinking about?
Not as far as new regulations are concerned. I would say that with the new administration, expect there to be more focus on compliance assistance and less on enforcement. I would expect to see the size of the enforcement staff decline over this administration. But that said, they will still be citing violations. They still have requirements for programmed inspections. If someone calls in and makes a complaint, expect them to show up. If you have a OSHA reportable incident where there's a amputation, loss of an eye, inpatient hospitalization, expect them to show up. If there's a fatality, expect them to show up. And so while there may be fewer inspections, you still need to be following the OSHA rules because you still will get a citation if you're not.
Yeah, absolutely. And the compliance is still important. Another thing I had jotted down, just you talked a little bit about those immediate deadlines that had already just passed and what's coming up in July. Is be looking further on the horizon. Is there anything we should be thinking about if somebody's checking this out in a couple of months or later down the year? Anything just tuck in the back of your head?
The biggest one would be the PFAS reporting requirements. So anyone that has manufactured or imported PFAS since 2011 has to do a audit and report by January of the PFAS that they've either manufactured or imported. And it doesn't have an exemption for your typical consumer devices. So you have to look at the things you bought off of Amazon. And if you went to Home Depot and bought things, you're trying to look as detailed into that as possible. And so if you were the person who purchased it online and the company you purchased from was Canada or in Europe, then if it had PFAS, you're an importer. And so you have to do documentation of your any PFAS that you imported or manufactured from 2011 to present and report that to the EPA.
Wow. I do think that we have been having those PFAS conversations also, but yeah, that's gonna feels like it's gonna throw your head for a loop.
It's a big subject, and I've already done a couple of those audits, and it takes a lot of time and really attention to detail to go and hunt out all the purchase records and search every item purchased and find if it contains PFAS or not.
Wow. Wow. I can't imagine just like in a personal world, like going back to things that I've purchased in 2011. It just mentally feels daunting. And a couple of years ago, we had a quote around here that was, "That's going to take longer than you think." And I feel like that might fit this perfectly for that PFAS. That seems like it's going to take longer than you think. And if you're waiting till the last minute to do any of that, that probably is going to put you up against a deadline that you don't want to be up against.
Yes, that opens in June where you can start reporting then. So if you want to go ahead and complete your audit so that you knew exactly what needs to be reported, or if you can say, no, we didn't manufacture or import any PFAS, then that's the kind of thing that you can go ahead and start tackling. And when it opens in June, you'll already be ready to report.
Wow. All right, good. We'll definitely share that. So my last thought for you, David, is just we're optimistic that most of our members are familiar with a lot of this. They're doing the right things, but maybe there's someone who just wants to double check or really ensure that they are more proactive. If they were to reach out to you, or you and your team, how does that beginning conversation start for a company that says, we're doing all the right things, but let's double check this?
Well, basically, you could give me a call or send me an email and say, here's our concern. Maybe we have gaps, or we've had a EHS person for the last decade, but we lost them and we've had trouble replacing them. And we're worried about the entropy in the system and our system slowly sliding away from that good standard that we've been operating at. We can perform a gap audit for your site and come in and look at environmental health and safety and look at each standard, see if it applies to you, and if it does, what the requirements are and what you're able to provide that in compliance, and basically map out everything that we see as a requirement. And then if there are any gaps in between there, or you only have concerns on the safety side or the environmental side, we can tailor it to whatever you need. And that's often a starting point when we start working with a new business.
Yeah, that's great. And I know you had mentioned, coming back and doing a couple more of these, including, what to do when OSHA shows up and a handful of others. So I appreciate that. I look forward to that. I know that the people watching this are also going to need to tune in and brush up on all of that information. Thank you for taking the time to do this, and to Walden for always being such a great partner. I really do appreciate you taking the time today.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for watching Inside Exchange, Topics for Manufacturers. We hope you found today's episode valuable. To learn more about the Council of Industry and explore additional resources, visit us at councilofindustry.org.